Hey, it's Kathleen Jasper, and today I'm talking about Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. This is going to be part one of this little two-part series I'm doing on this particular concept. We are going to talk about what these two things are, how to use them when planning your objectives, and how to think about them when you're thinking about student performance and your own performance on certain tests. Let's get started. All right, so today we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. These are two ways to think about building your learning objectives and understanding the complexity of tasks or assignments or even questions in your classroom. These are frameworks you can use to kind of understand the level at which you are pushing students. And you will see these methods applied on your teacher certification exam. So we're going to cover all of that. So let's have a look at exactly what Bloom's taxonomy is. Now, you may be familiar with this diagram. If you're brand new to teaching, you might not be familiar with this, but it's typically done in a pyramid type form, with the understanding that down here are the low level skills, meaning remembering and understanding are not as complex as evaluating, analyzing, and applying, right? Because if we're going to remember, those are kind of those rote memory things. What are the 4 nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule? What are the main parts of a cell? What are the 2 main components of a sentence? Who were the Axis powers in World War II? These are things you can memorize, you can quickly identify. It doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to do this. This is those rote memory questions that you have in school. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not important. You have to be able to remember and understand before you can move up and apply and analyze and create and all of that. So these skills down here are very important. It's just that we don't want to stay down here. We don't want to keep our students in this rote memory place. We want to bump the level of questioning. We want to bump the objectives. And so then we start to move up the pyramid here into apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Now, another thing you should understand about this particular diagram, it gives the impression that learning is linear and that we always start at remember, then we go to understand, then we go to apply, then we go to analyze, and people get really stuck on this linear progression. And that's not really how learning happens. Really, what's happening is we are jumping from here to here, back down to here. The way our brains work, we don't just learn in one straight shot up. And so while this is a very important diagram and we all need to understand this, please remember that this can be very fluid, that students will move in and out of these particular levels, and that it's not set in stone. I get a lot of questions from teachers and they say, well, you said apply, but create is above apply, and analyze is below evaluate. And so when we're talking about this, try to keep in mind that you have the lower skills here, and then you start to progress into the more complex skills. Here's why I use this type of a diagram in my book. So I get a lot of questions. Why does your diagram not match the exact Bloom's taxonomy? And you'll see in my books that I say this is a modified Bloom's taxonomy. And the reason why is because I like to add a few more skills for you to understand where they fall on this framework. So you can see here, remember and memorize. That's way down at the bottom. Okay. Anything related to that. Then we move into understand and identify. Identify would be something like labeling a chart, labeling a skeleton for its parts, labeling a map. Even though the student might have to work a little bit to label a map, it's still an identifying skill. They're basically putting their finger on it and identifying what it is. Then you might get into something like categorize, where you're putting things in certain columns. Let's say it's new vocabulary, and maybe you're putting in all the verbs in one column, all the nouns in another column, all the adjectives in another column. That's categorizing. And while it is on the lower end of this continuum, it certainly takes a lot more effort cognitively to do that. You're not just identifying the thing, you're actually now putting in its proper category. So you can see how we're bumping the level up a little bit. Then you might move to compare and contrast, which is like not just categorizing, but finding similarities and differences among things. Again, you're working that brain a little harder. Then you get to apply. Now, apply is where you use all this information that you just gained or that you just used, and then you apply it to something. You do something with it, okay? That could be in a mathematical word problem. Let's say you understand the Pythagorean theorem. We went through it. Now I put it in a word problem where you have to apply some sort of real world scenario to it. That ends up being applied. Maybe you understand sentence structure. Now you have to apply that by writing a paragraph or something like that. Evaluate and analyze, I feel, are the same thing. Those kind of make you, dig down into something, wonder why something is, what makes it do that. For example, if I'm talking about biology and I say, okay, if I'm down here into remember and memorize and identify, right? If I say, what are the 4 nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule? Well, the student can rattle that off, right? Then I might have the student categorize them or compare and contrast. Then I might jump up here and say, okay, how do those 4 nitrogen bases work together to do the job that the DNA molecule does? Well, now we're getting into these skills here where they have to think about it. They have to kind of take the components of these 4 nitrogen bases and understand how they work in order for them to work together to do what the DNA molecule is supposed to do. And so you can see how this is a high level skill. And then at the top, we have create. And again, we move through these skills, not linearly. We move through them in a way that's more fluid. But at the top, creation is when the student takes all this information and creates something. Now, that doesn't mean that they create a picture of a cell and then label it, because that's just identify and memorize. But maybe they create a scenario that's happening in the cell. Maybe they make up a story using the new vocabulary. Maybe they write a speech that the president is going to say during World War II based on all the information that they've learned. That is creation. And that's why it's at the top of the pyramid. Okay. And again, it's not linear. These things go up and down and in and out, and our brains don't act in a linear fashion. So keep that in mind when you're working with students. Now, another way to think about this is Webb's DOK. So it's similar to Bloom's taxonomy. It's just presented in a wheel. And there's been some controversy about this. I am using this diagram because I think it's an easy way to look at Webb's, but I have even read that Webb himself does not like this wheel because he doesn't think that it represents the idea. But for the sake of the presentation today and what I'm talking about, I think the wheel is a good way to present this information. Now, you can see here at level 1, we have a recall. And if we're relating that to Bloom's, it's the same thing as identify or remember. Recall is you ask a question and you can quickly say it. Okay. Memorizing, you can see up here, identify, memorize. I like this wheel because it has a lot of different verbs in it to show you what a recall question is. Now, skill number 2 is skill and concept. Now we're getting into the classify, separate, construct, modify, predict, bumping up that level a little bit. We're getting beyond just the recall. And then we have level 3, strategic thinking. Now we're bumped up even more. Strategic thinking means you're evaluating, you're analyzing, you're figuring things out, and then you're kind of making a plan. So we have the words assess, construct, that's kind of create there, critique, formulate, appraise or apprise, draw conclusions, cite evidence, differentiate. These are all higher level skills that students and we need to have in order for us to have that strategic thinking. And then finally, level 4 is extended thinking. Now we have the apply concepts. We have the connect, design. This portion of the Webb's depth of knowledge is usually done by assigning bigger projects over periods of time where students are working on something. You can't really assess these skills in one test question. This is something that takes a lot more time, but you can write test questions in your class that cover these areas here. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, but just understand that when you are questioning students, when you are writing objectives, when you are thinking about assignments and lessons, and when you are thinking about your own teacher certification exam, you want to understand the levels of complexity that are happening in your thinking, in your students' thinking, and in what they're doing. All right, so I hope you enjoyed part 1. Remember, there is a part 2, so go ahead and watch that. But we just reviewed what Bloom's taxonomy is and what the depth of knowledge wheel is for DOK. And in the next video, we're going to apply those to writing objectives and how to think about these when you are taking your own teacher certification exams. Have a great day.